For once, I'm not talking to myself. It's time to go beyond the book and get over your shelf.
Here we are. All right, Timothy Harding. Timothy Hardy. Hello. So do you want to be called Timothy or Tim? I don't take liberties with people's names.
I prefer Tim. It's more informal. I get called Timothy when I've been naughty, so you know, quite often, as you can imagine.
I worked with a woman named Kimberly, and there's this instinct in me to shorten people's names just automatically. And for a long time, I had to say, "Hey, what's up?" You know, I kept catching myself. I'm like, "Hey, what's up, Kim Burley?" So, Tim. All right. So, Tim, you were involved with this little release here.
Yes. I edited the book essentially using 4 different versions of the text, because with H.G. Wells' books, he kept on going back to them, making amendments, making corrections, and that was amongst the American editions and the English editions. So you always get slight variations between the text between the American editions and the London editions. And over the years, you know, extra amendments were created where he found even more mistakes he had to correct. So what we've got is a sort of a varium text using 4 different versions, basically. So you've got the first edition from 1896, which was the Heinlein London edition, used some of the text from that, used the best bits of the Stone and Kimball first American edition, and then of course he tried to do a definitive edition in 1924, the Atlantic text, but that had problems with it, and he kept on revisiting, making amendments. He did it again in 1927 in the Essex edition. It wasn't until 1933 that he made his final amendments in the 1933 Scientific Romances edition, which is the basis of this text. But we have found 2 additional pieces, amendments, that were included from the 1946 Penguin edition. But oddly enough, George Orwell actually got involved and found these mistakes and wrote a letter to H.G. Wells suggesting these improvements. The 1946 edition was approved by Wells, but was ultimately published several weeks after his death.
Wow.
So we haven't used the entire 1946 edition as the basis of the text, because obviously they weren't done by Wells's own hand. They were approved by him, but not done by his hand. So the Scientific Romances edition of 1933 is the fundamental basis of this text, with certain corrections made from either the first editions where appropriate, or the 1946 Penguin edition in 2 instances.
That's so cool. I'm getting a question here. Tim, do you tend to prefer text from the more recent editions, and when would you select text from an earlier edition that had been revised later?
Well, the original 1896 text is obviously the fundamental part of Wells' thinking, but as he grew in maturity as a writer, he changed some of the narrative within that. Most scholars prefer the Atlantic editions onwards, basically. So any text from 1924 onwards is what they call the Atlantic text, because that's where he started to do a definitive edition onwards. I mean, the Essex edition and the Scientific Romances edition, they both used the Atlantic text as the basis of their editions, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. But because they were copy read by American proofreaders, some of the language got cut in translation, which is why we've had to revert back to some of the language used in the original 1896 editions.
Yankees always mess things up.
Yeah.
Damn Yankees. There's actually a good question from Russell C. we're going to call him Russell C. So how different are the editions you reference? Is it plot or just language? Because what you had for Time Machine with that additional ending, that the lost last chapter, I like that a lot better than the one that was actually in the published book that I read when I was back in college. So that whole chapter was different. So Russell C wants to know how different is it, plot or just language and style, or is it just formalizing the text?
With Dr. Moreau, it's more formalizing and style of the text rather than plot itself. I mean, with the Time Machine, the Grey Man bonus chapter was excised from all versions of the text. That's a deleted chapter that we included as bonus material because we felt that having all the material available should be included, but that was excised by the original publishing house that Wells was working for back in 1895. They didn't want the plot of the Time Machine to go in the direction that the Grey Man chapter did, so that's why it was cut from the final product. Mm-hmm. But Wells, he went back to it and included it as a sort of standalone short story, as it was, and released it in one of his omnibuses in the 1930s, I believe. But we included it within the bonus material of the Time Machine for just to make sure we had everything available for you guys. And it's the same with the World of the Worlds. The short story, the Crystal Egg, is seen by many as a precursor to the events within the World of the Worlds. It's more like a prequel. A guy finds a crystal egg in an antique shop, and it turns out to be a viewing platform that the aliens from Mars can actually see what's going on on Earth.
So cool. Yeah, and you also had the Chronic Argonaut. Right? The Chronic Argonaut? Yeah. Is it the title?
The Chronic Argonauts was the first draft of H.G. Wells writing the Time Machine. So the plot outline from the Argonauts and to what the Time Machine became is vastly different. And there's only 7 years between the two, because obviously when he wrote the Chronic Argonauts in 1888, he was still effectively a student at that time, and that's why it was published in the student journal where he was studying.
So it's so cool because there's just something about that book itself is like a time machine. You just the whole rhythm of the words and the whole cadence. It just like going to a Shakespeare play for me. It just takes you back to the different, the power of language and just how it's changed over the years is so cool. Ivor, man. See, this is why I'm a writer, because I could just write things down and not try to pronounce them and offend people. But Ivor was saying, essentially the question is, what do you change and what do you leave? And is there an estate approval? I mean, do you have to get it approved by the Wells estate? I know it's public domain now, but do you have to get approvals for, like, we want to put out this version, can you give it your blessing, or is that just a nice thing to do?
With public domain work, there is no approval needed, because obviously any rights to that material is expired. So in theory, you could rewrite the book if you so wished, without any consequences. But to do so, I think, would be a disaster. So the changes we made, or I suggested, would be basically for clarity purposes, to make things in line with modern practice. So it's things like deleting unnecessary hyphens in words. If you've got a word like armchair, you wouldn't have arm-chair. It doesn't read right. So it's making small adjustments in line with modern practice. If you have the word hyena, you wouldn't necessarily want to spell that with two A's,
Mhm,
like the
mhm.
demon with an A in it. So it's making small adjustments like that without taking away the stylistic integrity of H.G. Wells himself, effectively.
Right.
So we didn't want to, change any of his narrative power, any of the true line of H.G. Wells' work.
Yeah. So it's really great, I think. And these are some of the books that are just well worth reading. And when you think about it, it's amazing to us. But so much time has passed since these books were written, and so much has been absorbed into the culture, and it's produced fruit that has evolved and changed over the years. But when you think about H.G. Wells writing these things, and it was sort of the first of its kind. I mean, these books were groundbreaking and just insanely imaginative. And
Yeah.
I mean, you can argue that some of it is well, I don't know about prophesying or coming true, but the things he imagined are just sort of, technology is catching up to some of it,
Yeah. He wrote a book in the 1930s called The Shape of Things to Come, and it was written in the early 30s. Yet he's talking about aircraft. He's talking about escalators. He's talking about lifts, glass lift going up and down, stuff that we would take for granted in today's society, but 90 years ago just didn't exist. So he had a wonderful vision of the future, and it's no surprise that H.G. Wells is regarded as being the father of science fiction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we got time for one last question, and I'm going to try to see if we can get one more guest on. But Peter wants to know if you were already an H.G. Wells fanboy, essentially, if you were already familiar with the text of the work, or did you just research it for these projects?
I researched it for these projects. It's remarkable, but before I started to work on the Time Machine, I hadn't read any of H.G. Wells' works. I was familiar of them, but I had to literally throw myself into some serious amount of research, and I spent a considerable amount of time looking at all the scholarly works about H.G. Wells, the different versions of the text available. I viewed and read so many different versions of the text to look at exactly what needed to be changed and where. I mean, some of the stylistic changes obviously were needed, but there were some areas where it ruined the plot. I mean, with the Invisible Man, there's a moment in chapter 3 where it's talking about him arriving in the village on the 29th of February, but that doesn't make sense logically. If you look at the text, the line of events and everything, it should have been the 9th of February. So it's making changes like that. There was elements in the War of the Worlds where he kept on confusing, or the editors, the proofreaders confused Manchester with Winchester, two cities in England that are not geographically close to each other. You're looking at sort of 500-600 miles apart. So it's changing things like that within the text, that if you know the geography of England, or that the time frame you're looking at the story, that those changes need to be corrected in order to make the story flow correctly. And it's the same with the Island of Doctor Moreau. There's some coordinates that are mentioned where the protagonist is shipwrecked, and he's supposed to be near the Galapagos Islands. In the original text, the coordinates used would place him more inland in Indonesia, in the islands of Sumatra. So those coordinates, the latitude and longitude, needed to be corrected to actually place him in the vicinity of the Galapagos Islands. And it's just a basis of changing, where it would say 105 degrees west, where, you know, instead of 105 degrees east, for instance. But small changes make, you know, all the difference to the story and plot line.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, you could obviously teach a master class on it now. So that was my impression too, even though Peter wrote the question. But yeah, I thought, oh, you must have already been a huge Wells scholar to jump in the deep end. But wow, it's even more impressive to know that you did it exclusively for these projects.
Yeah, I'm certainly an H.G. Wells fan now. I've kind of bathed in H.G. Wells for the last effectively 2 years. I've been working on the H.G. Wells books now since February 2019, when I first started on Time Machine. Rapidly moved on to The Invisible Man, working throughout on War of the Worlds, and then, you know, most of almost exclusively throughout 2020. I was neck deep rather, within the Island of Doctor Moreau. I will add that the text of the Island of Doctor Moreau, it contains a lot of seafaring words. A lot of people probably wouldn't understand unless they did a lot of sailboating and everything. So, you know, terminology like a mizzen spanker boom. And binnacle lanterns. Unless you go on boats a lot, you probably won't know what those are. So within the text of this edition, there are quite a few extensive explanatory notes for this edition, just to explain what some of the terminology means, and some of the background behind it as well.
I love, I mean, I got to work spanker boom into my daily conversation. I need to add that word into my vocabulary, spanker boom, because I would not, if I said, what's a spanker boom, I'd be like, well, I think E.L. James wrote that in 50 Shades or something, because it doesn't make any sense. But so, yeah, that's cool. So I appreciate your time today. It's been an hour already. I've been streaming, and I want to see if maybe we get one other person on the line just to say hey and bow in. But this has been tremendous. I love this. I love hearing about the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, and you know, we all talk about what a tremendous amount of work it is. But I think just hearing this, you've dedicated years of your time to just helping make these books possible, and you're just one person on the team here. So it's a lot of work from a lot of people.
I'm honoured to be part of the project, to be quite honest. You know, working with the Suntup team is effectively a dream come true. You know, it provides me with the creative side that I've always yearned for. I don't get it within my day job, so this gives me the outlet to really let shine some of the creativity that I want to provide. So I'm extremely grateful to Paul for allowing me to join his team. Effectively, I am truly honoured.